And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Julie Yak, and I have a couple of quick announcements, and then we'll pass off to Colin here to talk about building .NET applications with the Adoxio framework. So as you just heard, we are recording today, so if for some reason you don't consent to having any interactions of yours recorded, then go ahead and exit now and watch the recording later on. We'll post tweet hopefully later today when I get a chance to get that posted for us. We're always looking for speakers, and we've got a new speaker coming to us next month. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But if there's a topic that you're interested in hearing about, if you want to present yourself and you're not sure how to go about getting your name out there and having folks hear the knowledge that you'd like to share, drop me an email and let me know, and I'd love to walk through and help you with that and help you figure out how you can join the speaker circuit, so to speak, and we'd love to help you get started with that. So as I said, we've got a new meeting in August about TypeScript, doing some client-side coding done right. And what else would you like to have? That's currently the last one that we have slated. I expect that we'll get our docket filled pretty quickly. So if there's something you'd like to talk about, something you'd like to hear about, let me know, and I'll do my best to get that arranged for us. We work a lot with the folks over at CRMUG. They've sent folks over here to our meeting. I would imagine that several of you came here because of that. And we've got several webinars coming up. We also have their primary event coming up. Their CMUG Summit is coming up. And I know that I'm already booked to be there. I've got a couple of sessions to deliver, as well as I'll be helping a small group run the hands-on lab for all the Dynamics 365 CRM-focused content. Right now we've got, Inspire that's happening, partner conference, and then shortly we'll be having Ignite and Envision. I currently don't have planned to attend either of those large Microsoft conferences. That always changes around here, so if any of you do wind up going to those conferences, drop us a line. Maybe we can have a quick meetup or a coffee or just say hi. See, I told you that my announcements would be very quick, so I'm going to pass off over to Colin with Adoxio. He's been part of the Legacy ADX team for a while, and he has been a great help here to us at the user group, helping us maintain our behind-the-scenes presence and helping us run the group. So with that, Colin, I will pass off to you because they came to listen to you, not to me.
Great, thanks, Julie.
I'm going to be
and
on
hi,
the...
everyone. So let me just switch the presentation deck to our topic now. And so here everybody's good can see. All right. So today we're here to talk about building .NET applications and using this free open source framework that myself and Adoxio have released back in March at Extreme 365, almost called CRM. And we've made it open source, so you can go freely look at the code of all of this as well. And you can use it in any of your projects without any license or anything like that. So it's free to anybody to use. And I think just today the goal is to kind of describe it all to everyone, get everybody to understand what it is. And a large part of that is about the authentication method that it uses. So the Adoxio Connect Framework is really around simplifying your applications from an authentication standpoint. So as Julie said, I'm with Adoxio. If you're not familiar with Adoxio, it used to be ADX Studio until Microsoft acquired the Portal product from us, and then we spun off the rest of the company as a new services arm called Adoxio. So we've been around for quite a while, as long as ADX Studio was, so over 10 years. And a lot of the original ADX Studio staff still stayed with Adoxio today, and we have a number of customers and a lot of employees and offices all across North America, and we work in a ton of sectors. Obviously, Portals is our kind of cup of tea that we will do for just about anybody, but we are also a huge Dynamics 365 partner here in Canada as well as the United States. So we do lots of non-Portal implementations as well, just Dynamics.
Stupid shit. Right.
So that's enough about that. So let's talk about a little bit what we're going to cover in this session today. So as I said, the Adoxio Connect Framework is really about a connection to CRM. So it simplifies that connection. So I first want to get everybody on the same page about all the authentication types that you can use to connect to CRM as you're building apps for CRM, how you might connect to those. In particular, we're going to talk about the new server-to-server authentication, and then we'll do a walkthrough of the server-to-server authentication. And there's some documentation, a couple of blog posts out there, but it would be good for a lot of people, I think, to see this as well. I've had some questions since we've launched the framework about how to exactly do that. So we're going to take a step-by-step walkthrough of that. And then once we understand server-to-server authentication, we'll look at exactly what is the Adoxio Connect framework and basically what simplification it provides to you in terms of building apps. And then we'll look at a demo of the Adoxio Connect framework in action, and then I'll talk to you about exactly how Adoxio uses this framework and how you can use it yourself in your own projects. And again, like I said, it's a completely open source, free-to-use framework where the source code's completely available to you to either enhance or contribute back to the GitHub repo that we have it hosted on as well. So let's dive in with authentication types and just kind of get an understanding of kind of where we've come from and where the Dynamics 365 SDK is kind of going in that. So previously, in the past, we've kind of always focused as a developer around the authentication of things being what would be called a user credentials authentication, also referred to as a named account. And if you're familiar with writing any code and using the CRM SDK, you probably are pretty familiar with either the XRM client library or the XRM tooling library. So both of those libraries kind of provide an assistance to developers to helping them establish a connection to the CRM, as well as a context that they can then use to make all of their queries about. There's been a couple of authentication methods to handle all of that. So you can usually do your standard Active Directory or your IFD for your on-premise, as well as there's an OAuth as well. And then for your online, it is all managed by the Office 365. And behind that Office 365 is actually Azure AD. So it's just another LDAP directory that's actually hosted in the cloud. So all of our previous applications that we had to build always focused around this user credential context. So you always had to have a named user in the CRM. You had to assign them a license or set them as a non-interactive user, but often we would set them as a full license, and the person would have to pay for it, or whoever was building this application would potentially have to pay for another license. So there were some downsides to that. And as such, the XRM tooling library really right now only supports the name user credentials with the CRM Service Client. We are expecting that they will add the server-to-server authentication, but because it is so new and just recently introduced, they haven't yet extended that CRM Service Client to support an easy-to-use constructor for all of that. So to help alleviate the whole user credentials problem and basically bring Dynamics into, I would say, kind of the modern age of authentication, especially to try to help build the developer population, because of the developer population outside of Microsoft, will basically be much more familiar with what's called a server-to-server authentication, which is kind of like a client ID in secret or a certificate that does your authentication. So a lot of REST endpoints or APIs out there will utilize this whole client ID, client secret type of framework to do their authentication instead of user credentials. And this is kind of important in the fact that you don't have to have a named user and you can use it without any license. So let's understand server-to-server a little bit more. Important point here is that it's online only. So at present, it does not work with your on-premise system because it is tied to an Azure AD application registration. So it only works with Dynamics 365 online presently. It will have you register an Azure Active Directory application as part of that as well. And basically the big difference here is that as part of that application registration is that instead of a username or an email address and a password, you're instead using a client ID and a client secret or a certificate to do that authentication. So additional authentication methods or ways of authenticating you with the actual application through this client credentials. And again, the client credentials is much more of a standard for APIs or service-based applications, kind of where you're in this non-interactive login. So if you want to think of a non-interactive login as basically when you're not having a user participate in the session. So there's some really good examples out there, which we'll look at in a second as well. And another key point here is that there's no user license required for all of this. So you can add a client credential login to your Dynamics 365 instance and not have to worry about assigning a license. So you don't have to worry about that cost that you might have had before. And you can kind of give them out as much as possible and also close them down as quickly as you want as well. So you can really lock down the client credentials just as you can a user credential, and also do all the same rights management with it as you would a normal user. So there's a lot of benefit to this as well. Microsoft really documents this server-to-server authentication around the web applications that you can build for AppSource. So this whole server-to-server authentication really was pushed quite strongly for those that are using AppSource, but there's no reason actually that you can use it outside of AppSource. And that's actually how Adoxio has been using it a lot right now, is that we use it completely outside of AppSource, and we even use it outside of web applications. So there are lots of use cases beyond what is documented on the MSDN site by Microsoft as well. And you can basically take the documentation they have and apply it to a number of different applications as you see fit from a non-interactive standpoint. So what are those use cases? So obviously, just like Microsoft's documented on MSDN, you have your web application. And this could be an ASP.NET. It could also be a PHP-based application. It could really be anything that can be able to interact with a REST API of some sort. So you can use this server-to-server authentication even outside the SDK as well. Other good use cases would be a console application. Let's say you wanted to build a console application that's going to run on a VM somewhere or some server, and it's going to be on a Windows scheduled task. So again, that's kind of a non-interactive use case. So you would potentially be able to use server-to-server authentication in that sort of standpoint. The Azure Function App is kind of like your cloud-hosted version of the console application, but you can plug it into a whole bunch of other Azure services like Logic Apps and whatnot out there. And it, again, is kind of that does not run as an interactive user. It runs kind of as a service in the background with nobody kind of logging in or managing it. So it's also a good candidate for the server-to-server authentication. Windows service as well. So if you wanted to have some sort of Windows service polling things out there, then you could build a Windows service that was based upon server-to-server authentication. So hopefully you can get the idea here that there are a lot of different use cases to this server-to-server authentication that you can utilize in different locations. So I think rather than just kind of talking through slides, it would be good to kind of have like a little walkthrough of how you would actually set up server-to-server authentication. So I will show you how we do here at Adoxio on our tenant and setting up a brand new application, and we'll write a little console program that will then connect to using that server-to-server authentication here. So I'm just going to switch to presenting my desktop here, and we will then switch to our Azure AD within the Azure portal here. So we're going to start off in the Azure portal because that's where you actually have to start by creating your application. So the first thing you actually need to do for your server-to-server application is basically create a registration in your Azure AD. So if you go to your Azure portal, you do need to be an Active Directory administrator to do this. So you will need appropriate permissions, which you might not have, and you might need to talk to your Azure admin about. I happen to have those for the Adoxio tenant here, so I'm just going to navigate to the Active Directory on the side. You could also find this if you wanted by clicking the search button at the bottom and just searching for Active Directory, and it should come up here as well for you. Once in the Active Directory, now that all Active Directory is actually managed from the new portal instead of the old portal, we have a bunch of things in here, but the specific thing we want to pay attention to is this app registrations, or over here on the left-hand side, the app registrations. And if we go into this, you can see, and you probably, if you have an Azure AD tenant, if you log into this, you're probably going to see already a ton of different app registrations in here. So you can see we've got some for the Microsoft CRM portals. So this Microsoft CRM portals actually use server-to-server authentication behind the scenes as well. So when you set up your portal, it actually creates an application in your Azure AD tenant and associates that with the portal that you're creating. There's obviously lots of other stuff that we have in here. We have some demo things, but as you install other apps and everything like that within here, they will potentially make their own registrations as well. So as you use app stores, there's potential that they will register within your Azure Active Directory as well as part of this. So let's create a new application, and we'll just call this XRN Virtual Webinar. And we're going to say it's a web app API. These settings here do not play a huge role at this time. You could leave it as a native application as well, but for our purposes, I'm just going to use it as a general web app API. And then you would want to input a single sign-on URL or a sign-on URL. And this is just something to help you uniquely identify the application. You don't have to actually have this as something that's specific unless you're going to be calling the Azure AD to pull this information as part of the registration. So that's the 3 pieces of information I need to create my app, and all I have to do then is click Create, and it's going to go ahead and create that for me. It creates it right away, so we do see it here right at the bottom right away. So there's our XRM Virtual Webinar app. And as soon as it's created, you can see here we have some properties about it. And this is something you're going to want to pay special attention here, because you're going to need to start collecting information out of this application so that you can then use it within the application that you're creating as well. So the first thing you want to be very aware of is what's called the application ID. And that's basically your unique identifier for this app. So it's a GUID that identifies this app. And I'm just going to copy this out, and I'm going to save it to a notepad file, because we actually are going to need to start building up some settings to make our connection with the server-to-server authentication. So you can see here I need to store the client ID. We also need to get the client secret. So let's go look at how we would do that. And on the right-hand side, or in the middle pane here, you have all the different settings for this application. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the keys, and we're going to want to generate a key that we're going to use as that client secret. So now for my purposes here, I'm just going to create a dev key, and I'm going to set it to never expires. If you were creating a production application, you would probably want to set this to have some sort of expiry period. You can also remove and delete keys out of here as well. So if you wanted to revoke somebody's access, you could do this, and you can create an additional key for each person that you wanted to access this application. So you can kind of segment them as different passwords or different tokens to access this application. You'll notice it says here value will be displayed on save. So if we save it now, it actually presents us with that key. And it's very important that you copy this key out of here. So this time around I'm not going to copy it, but if we go and navigate away from keys and we navigate back, you'll notice the key value is hidden. And there is actually no way to retrieve it, and that's because it's stored in your Azure AD using irreversible encryption. So it is also salted in that LDAP database within there, so that you can't access it again. So it is very important that you do copy it out right away as soon as you do create it, because it is only available that one time. So let's just delete that one since I didn't copy it out and can't use it, and let's just create another one with our never expires. And there's our key. So let's copy that out, and we'll just punch it in to our file here. So the next thing that you really need to do is you need to ensure that this application has the correct permissions to be able to access the applications that you want. So you're creating this application and this registration in your Azure AD. You need to say what this application can do in your Azure AD. So from there, we can look at the required permissions and see what APIs that it's allowed to access. So by default, all of them will have the Windows Azure Active Directory, and that is something that you require to be able to just log in and use this application or this application registration. But for CRM, we obviously need to add another one as well. So if you click the Add button, you'll get a Select API. And from here, you'll get a whole bunch of pre-built APIs that Microsoft has pre-registered in this service as well. You'll notice one of these is Dynamics CRM Online. It is still called CRM in this space here. It hasn't probably been renamed at this point. But there are a ton other ones in here as well. So you can go and use this kind of app registration for a variety of different things as well. So it doesn't have to be just limited to Dynamics CRM Online. So for us, we want Dynamics CRM Online, and then we're going to give it the permission to access a CRM Online as an organization user. And this is the only permission we actually have to give it, or the scope that we have to give it. And once we do that, we select it, and then we say done, and it will then add that associated permission to there. So that's actually all we have to do here for the application setup in your Azure AD. The other important information that we do need to grab is what's called a tenant ID. And you can actually grab that from within here. I'll show you kind of two ways that you can do this. You can go back to your Azure AD tenant here, and if you go down to your properties, it will actually give you what's called a directory ID, and that is actually your tenant ID. So you can copy that out of there. But another way to do this is actually when you go to a Dynamics 365 instance. So let me just go to demo instance that we're going to be using. So if I go to this, you'll notice it takes me to a password prompt. And this is going to be important to remember here. You'll notice that, hey, that's the same GUID that we saw in the Azure AD. And it's taken me to login.microsoftonline.com. So what we call this is actually the authority that we're validating our credentials with. So it's very important that we note down this actual whole URL, because this whole URL we're going to need later, because we need to tell our server-to-server authentication, hey, we have this client ID and this client secret. Who should you validate this against? You can't just validate it against login.microsoftonline. It doesn't know what directory that tenant exists in or anything like that. So we need to be very specific in saying, hey, please authenticate against this authority. This is the tenant that contains that client ID and that client secret, which you will find permission to as well. So let's just copy this out. And we're also going to just paste this here. And let's also copy out that tenant ID. So we have that here. So now the last piece of information that we need is our resource URL. So resource URL could be a number of different things. In our instance, we want it to be the CRM instance that we're accessing. So I'm just going to grab that internal webinar demo.crm.dynamics.com, and I'm going to paste that in there. So these are the 4 key pieces of information that you really need to be able to make that server-to-server connection. Once you have this information, then we can actually start writing our application, and using the Active Directory authentication library, we can make a nice easy call to that. So let's do that. We're just going to start a new simple console application here. And we'll just go okay with the defaults. And so because we're building a console application that is going to use both the CRM SDK as well as Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, for the authentication, we need to first add some references. So we're just going to open up the NuGet Package Manager, and let's first search for CRM SDK. And we do want to grab this Microsoft.crmsdk.core assemblies. This is the one that comes with your XRM SDK DLL. So that is the core Dynamics 365 SDK. And it's got some dependencies as part of it. So it's going to pull in the identity model. So we'll just accept everything that is there. And then the next one that we need to bring in is the Active Directory related one. And that one is important because we need to bring it in to do the authentication with the server-to-server authentication. Now, there are a ton of versions of this Active Directory library. It is important to note that for CRM, you do want to use a specific version of this Active Directory library. You can use the latest, but you will run into a couple of road bumps. So Microsoft, in the documentation they provided, is recommending that you use version 2.22.302, basically 022, or 222, sorry. So we're going to want to install that one. And we'll go ahead and accept the agreements. And so now we have our NuGet packages. So we have the CRM SDK proxy, the XRM SDK, and then we have our identity model and then our Active Directory. So those are the three libraries that we really need to bring in or are key to making our program function. And basically now what we want to do is I'm going to go grab these. Let's just go grab all of this and then we'll write some code around it. Make our life a little easier and faster here. So let's get rid of this. We don't need it for now. And so basically what we want to do is we want to start creating our authentication context, which is going to allow us to connect to this system. To do that, the first thing we need to do is create what's called a client credential. So if you remember, we were talking about client credentials and user credentials. The first thing, oops, let's just pull in. That is not the right one. Let's try client credential. There we go. So remember we were talking about between user credential and client credential. Client credential is the one that we want to use because that one is going to use our client ID and our client secret. And then we're going to feed this client credential into an authentication context for the Active Directory authentication library. So let's just add our parameters in terms of the client ID and the client secret. And that basically is the first variable that we need to create. And then the next one is the auth context or the authentication context. And for this, we're going to create a new authentication context. And there are a number of different constructors that you can use for this. We are going to use, do I have the right one here? Looks like it. So for our authentication context, we need to tell it, again, that authority. So in here, we want to take that login.microsoft.com. And just to make sure, you could copy that whole string in that I had before, or you could just kind of parameterize it with the tenant ID as well. And so now we have our client credentials and our authentication context. So now we know we want to take these credentials and authenticate them against this authority. So we know that's the login.microsoft.com. So now the next thing we want to do is basically we want to get a auth response. And to do that, we're going to use our authentication context, and then we're going to call the acquire token method. And this one has a ton of different constructors on it as well. But in here, we're going to want to pass basically the resource that we're wanting to access. So that's the CRM instance. And the reason we want to do that is we want to say, hey, Active Directory, we want access using these credentials to this item. And that resource being the Dynamics 365 instance. And the next parameter we're going to want to pass is, say, the client credentials. Say we want access to this resource using these credentials. So once we've done that, we've basically, those are the three steps or the three items that you need to really do to be making or getting a token from the Active Directory library. So let's just make sure we got our console rights in the right place here, just so we have some sort of output. So now, once we have the authentication context, we can actually now start creating a CRM SDK proxy using the new web client to do that. So we'll just add a using statement and we'll say web proxy client. And in here, we want a new organization web proxy client. And let's just bring in our CRM SDK reference. And what this basically takes is your service URL. So that would be your resource URL. And then you will want to add to that basically the organization service, but with a web slash to it and telling it the SDK version you want to use. So we'll just, whoops, make sure we copy the right thing here. So now that we have that in, that basically forms our entire service URL that we want to add. And then it does require that we have defined strongly types or not strongly types. So if you're familiar with doing older CRM development, you might be familiar with the late bound and the early bound. We do not want to use strongly types in this case just to make our lives simple, and I think a lot of the development people are doing these days would not use strongly typed objects, so I think a lot of you will not be using that. And what have we got going on here? So make sure we get our parameters correct. It wants a URI, so instead of just a string, let's actually give it a URI, and a URI just takes string as a parameter. So now we have our web proxy client. So you're thinking, oh, now we can just make our CRM calls as we normally would with this web proxy client. But this web proxy client right now, you'll notice, has no awareness of the authentication that we're using. So we actually need to take what was retrieved from the authentication context and that acquire token method and actually attach it to this web proxy client. So to do that, the web proxy client has a header token that you can inject or add the auth response to. And basically what we want to do is take that auth response, and within that auth response, there's what's called an access token. And that access token is actually a JSON web token. So you take that access token and you associate it with the web proxy client, and that is basically what is going to add your authentication to every request you make now using the web proxy client. So now that we've done that, we can just now do a simple kind of who am I type of execution against the CRM. So we can say web proxy client.execute and say new who am I request. And let's just bring in the messaging. And we're just going to want to cast this as a who am I response. Oops. So we've basically done a single line that's going to make a request to the CRM using that web proxy client, and that web proxy client has that access token that we grabbed from Azure AD using the Active Directory authentication library, accessing our authority with the tenant ID, using the client credentials, the client ID and the client secret to get that token, and then attached it to it, and then we can make that request. So now, let's end that line. And now we can basically do console.write and write out the response that is going to get. So we can do, let's just say, who am I response. And within here, just because the response comes back, we just kind of want to print it out in some nice text. So the first thing we're going to do is just kind of cast it into an array, and then we'll be able to kind of read the data that comes back from it. So response to array. And if you're familiar with the who am I response, it's basically going to give you the business unit, the organization ID, as well as the GUID of the user that you've added to the CRM that is actually making this request. So what that means is that the access token is going to be associated to something which is then going to be that person that we are impersonating within the CRM. So now, provided everything is right, we should be able to, actually before we start this, let's maybe add a breakpoint so we can actually walk through this. So let's just start that again. And so we kick right into the beginning of the main method here, and we set our parameters, write a little console line write. First thing we do is create our client credentials. If you take a look at that, all you can visibly see is your client ID. It will not show your client secret. Remember that your client secret is kind of the equivalent of your password, so it's not something that's going to be exposed all the time. And then we want to create our authentication context, and that looks like it's got our authority properly, everything like that. And then the next thing we want to do is do our acquire token. So again, using our resource, which is the CRM instance that we want, and our client credentials. And it's basically made a request out to Azure AD in that point. And again, this library, the ADAL library, is very efficient and very fast. So now we can actually look at that response. So in that time that I just clicked next, it basically sent out a request to Azure AD, said, here are the client credentials, here are the resource I want, give me a token that's going to allow me to do that. So all we got back was this nice JSON web token, which is considered a bearer token. And actually, if we take this token, and there's a nice little tool that you can use on the web. It is jwt.io. So you can actually take that encoded token and paste it here. And then you can see what's in this token. So a JSON web token usually makes up a whole bunch of different claims. And within that will be basically a JSON response with those claims. So in here we have our audience, and that's really the resource we want to access. The issuer is also considered the authority that we're getting this token back from. And then you can see some other information like the app ID. So that's the app ID we're using to access. So this is basically that user that we're impersonating here, that application from Azure AD that we're using. So these are all the claims that come with it. So now the next thing will be is that we're going to create our web proxy client and add that token. So that access token is going to be added as the header token to the web proxy client. And then we're going to run that who am I response. We're actually going to run into an issue here because we have not completed a couple of steps that we still need to do. So what we've done so far has created our application in Azure, created the credentials that we need, but we haven't said to the CRM, these credentials are allowed for somebody to access or to be able to access the CRM. So we actually get back a 401 authorized because the CRM doesn't know who this is. And you get basically saying there was an anonymous request and you should go to this URL using this resource, and basically this is saying to you, go to this URL as an interactive user and provide your credentials to authenticate properly. So we need to actually take the next step of taking these client credentials and making them valid in the CRM system now. So let's go to our CRM itself here. So we've got our internal webinar demo here, and if we go to the security section in settings, and this is just a blank, I actually just provisioned this probably about 5 minutes before we started. So this is just a blank CRM. There's no customizations made to it whatsoever. It has no solutions added at all. It is just right out of the gate, fresh CRM instance or a Dynamics 365 instance. So if we go to our security and go to our users, and you're thinking at this moment, you're thinking, wait, you can't add users in Dynamics 365 online anymore. You have to go to the Office 365 portal, create a user in there, and assign them a license. Well, an interesting change in the Dynamics 365 release is that they've added this concept of application users. So you'll notice this new view in the system user section here. And if we go to application users, you'll notice there are none. And we can actually hit the new button from here, and we can actually create application users. It's important that if you do load up on the default user screen, everything will be locked. You can't edit anything from here, but there is a new form in CRM called application user. And if you switch to that form, you'll notice things become editable. So we can now add that application ID, and again, that is the client secret or what was in the Azure AD application. So if we go back to our application registrations and we find our webinar demo, there is our application ID. So we want to copy that out, and we want to paste that in as our application ID for the user. This is how it's making the association between the two of them, is by listing this application ID in CRM. And then we want to give it a name, so we'll just give it an XRM virtual app. And then you can make these whatever you want, actually. So they don't have to be specific or anything like that. So this could be XRM virtual at abc.com. It doesn't have to be the domain of the tenant that the CRM instance is. If you are building applications using this and you are kind of doing a multi-tenant approach, it will be important that you do name these things appropriately, because this is what your end consumers of your application are going to see. If they want to do any disabling as well, then they would be doing it from this instance. So once we've filled all of that out, we basically will hit save. And behind the scenes, it's creating a Dynamics 365 user. It's actually creating another Azure AD object behind the scenes as well. And here's the GUID for that object in Azure AD. So now we have our user, but we haven't really assigned any permissions to this. And this is just like your normal user in Dynamics 365 where you would assign a role. So we can go in here and you have all your default roles. So one thing you definitely need to be aware of is that server-to-server authentication actually blocks you from using any of the default roles. So you can't just go and assign it system administrator and kind of call it a day. They've kind of prevented that so that you do actually have to do some security management to do this. And this is a good thing that they've done because it provides a way of really locking down the applications and what they have access to. I'm just going to create a new role called the S2S users. And within here, the only thing I'm going to give it access to is the contact entity. And to do the who am I request, I don't even need to do this. But we're also going to look at how we can quickly call the contact entity and retrieve the results from it using the server-to-server authentication, just like you would using user credentials. So we'll save and close that role, which will create it. And then we'll go back to our user and actually assign that role. So if we go back to security, go to users, we're going to switch our view to that application users, and there's our user, and we just want to click on manage roles and then assign them that S2S users role. So now that we've done that, we should now be actually able to rerun our application. So let's just stop it here from debugging again and restart it. And we'll step back in. Let's just quickly fast forward through this Active Directory. Since we've seen that, let's just make sure we got our token back. It was pretty quick. So there's our token again. And now it's going to create that web proxy client. It's going to add that token to the header. And then it's making that who am I request. And provided everything worked, we got back a response, and you can see in here, there is the business unit, the organization ID, and the user ID that we all created. So now we can successfully make requests to the CRM, and you can see we just printed all those nicely out in this console window here for that. So at this point, you're now able to kind of use your CRM SDK as you would normally expect. So we could do other things like creating a normal organization service context. So we can go service and say new organization service context. And then let's just bring in the appropriate reference. And then within that service context, we want to pass our web proxy client. And the reason we kind of use the organization service context is the beauty of it is it has that link provider as part of it. So we can say var contacts service.create query and just say we want to query the contact entity, and let's just get them all and say to list. And let's just quickly run this again, and we'll just set up a debug there, and we'll just look at the results in the actual debugging window instead of taking any time to print them out here. So we've reached our top of our main. I'm just going to hit play so we can skip all past everything we've kind of already looked at, and we should get basically to our service context here. It's going to create our service context, and then it's going to make that query. And it actually found no contacts. That's because it's a brand new CRM. So let's just stop this for a sec, switch back to our CRM, and let's go quickly create a contact just so we can make sure we prove that this is actually querying the context entity. So we'll call this XRM. Webinar. And then we'll just save that, and then we'll go back and we'll hit play on our application again. Again, jump past the first breakpoint to the second one. Make our contacts query, and there we go. We've got our contact record here, and if we go look at the attributes, we've got all of the attributes that are default there, but you can see the last name is virtual webinar. So it's successfully made a query to that CRM and retrieve the data from it. So you could do any of your normal SDK methods from here as well. provided you've provided the appropriate permissions. So if we were to switch this to account, now there's nothing in account, but let's run this time. And remember, we didn't give access in the web role to account. So running this should provide us with basically a permission or a permission issue to do that. So there we go. We've got our permission issue doing the query to the account entity, saying principal user does not have the privilege of read accounts, and it gives you all that privilege ID. If you're familiar with the kind of the Windows event logs or any error logs, this is kind of the standard error message you'll get when somebody isn't have the right privilege to be able to access the data in CRM. So again, that user in CRM, that's just like you're used to, and that web role or that security role is basically what adds all the controls. So it's pretty easy to use this server-to-server authentication, and provided you understand all the steps to doing the setup. But the idea of the Adoxio Connect framework is that we want to make this a lot easier for you. So we don't want you to have to worry about all this authentication context and having it standard in your application or anything like that. So the Adoxio Connect kind of simplifies this process for you and takes care of the whole acquiring token part, so you don't have to worry about it. You basically don't need to have any knowledge about Azure Active Directory library. You just know that you want to access the CRM using server-to-server authentication, so you would need these pieces of information. So let's just stop and we'll switch back to our presentation here. And this guy. All right. So just to review what we've kind of covered, we kind of covered looking at creating an application in Azure AD, as well as we captured that tenant ID because that is important information to do that. We added the application user to Dynamics 365 because without adding them, they wouldn't be able to access the instance. And then we assigned a non-default security role. And again, it's very important to note that this is a non-default security role so that you can basically have to assign it the permissions. Basically, if you take what's called a least privilege approach to all of your security role configuration, then this non-default should be kind of standard operating procedure for you as part of this. So what is the Adoxio Connect framework? Basically, it simplifies everything we just looked at. So it is that Dynamics 365 context based upon that web proxy client. It utilizes the server-to-server authentication and kind of simplifies it by creating you a settings manager. And it is an implementation of that Active Directory library. So it takes all the pieces that we just looked at and basically sticks it into a very simple to use application for you, or a simple to use library for you to use. So again, not much on the slides here. Let's kind of dive into the code. So let's look at a demo of basically the same functionality that we just did now using basically the Adoxio Connect framework and see how it's a little different from what we did. Just going to switch back to the desktop here. And we'll go back to my Visual Studio, and I will change it to white for those that do prefer it. I do normally use the dark, so we'll go back to blue, which is the standard Visual Studio. Much be a little nicer on the eyes for some of you. Just give Visual Studio a moment. All right, so instead of creating a brand new solution or anything like that, let's go to our solution. And let's just add a brand new project. And let's add another console app, and we can just call it, console app 1's fine. And so again, the first thing we want to do, we're creating a CRM application, but we're doing it using the Adoxio Connect framework. So the easiest thing for you to do is go to your NuGet package manager and just search for Adoxio, and the Adoxio Dynamics Connect framework will come up. You can grab the latest version. What's great about this is it actually has dependencies to all the other libraries that you need. So you just actually need to call and install this one library, and it's going to install all these other libraries for you. So it's going to install that identity model, the core assemblies, the Active Directory library, and it also is going to install JSON. And we'll just accept everything from there, and it'll go add all those things to your application for you. So once that's done, basically we can go into the program here, and now just to again make my life simple, I'm just going to copy these settings out. And we'll put those at the top of the program. And I'll show you two ways in which you can do this in terms of managing those settings. So we'll go var CRM context, and we'll go new CRM context. And that is actually an object in the Adoxio Connect Framework, the CRM context, and we'll just say using that. So we've created a number of constructors within this library. The default one will basically read from your app config. So it uses the configuration manager, and it basically looks at your app config and says, does it have these certain settings in this app config? And we'll use them from there. So you can use this for web applications and create transformation files for all your deployments. So you have different settings for each of your environments, but we also have other constructors where you can pass an S2S settings object, which is an object in the Adoxio Connect library as well. You can actually just pass a resource and a token. So if you wanted to go and get your token manually yourself somehow, then you can do that. And then you can also just pass the resource that you want to access. The one we're going to use here is we just want to pass all of these parameters that we've got up here to this constructor. So let's add our client ID and our client secret, our resource, so that's the resource URL, and then the tenant ID. And then we also have an option here, if you wanted to override the get token method that we do have in the library as well, then you're free to provide your own function to do that get token method if you wanted to. There is a default one in there, so you don't have to worry about it. So you can just leave that parameter out if you're okay with using the default, which most of you should be. There might be some other reason that you might want to override that to provide some additional logic in it or something else. So we do provide that flexibility for you to do that. So we add this one line, and that does all that ADAL work for us. It creates a web proxy client, as well as it creates a service context for you as well. So we can just do CRM client, and then within here, we have the service context, and we have our web proxy client. So let's just go grab some code here that says we're going to use our response, write out that, and we'll paste them in. And so instead of web proxy client in our old one, we're going to use CRM context dot web proxy clients. And let's just bring in our references. And now that we've done that, let's just add a breakpoint up here, and then we should be able to run this application, and it's going to run just as our last one did. Oh, hold on here. Let's make sure we set our default startup project to our new application. And let's just try that again. All right, so we've gone through our settings. It's got all those same settings as we had before. And then in this one line, we're going to end up with that CRM context that has your service context and your web proxy client. You're not going to be able to evaluate them like this, but if we run our response, then we should successfully get back our response. And there's the same information that we saw in our other applications. So you can see how we've really simplified, and you don't have to worry about any of that authentication or have any knowledge to the ADL or anything. So authentication is a hard thing for people to kind of do, and it just adds a level of complexity to applications. So if we can take away that complexity for developers, then it really simplifies the process for them to being able to build applications. So that CRM context does all that for you and makes it really simple for you to do. So we just step over this. We'll see it prints out our who am I response. So let's just go the other route, and we can do our contacts, and we can do our CRM context dot service context this time, and that just gives us our link provider. And we can do our contact entity again. And we'll just to-list this, and then we'll just simply look at it in the debugger here as well. So if we play that again, there's our CRM context, play it through, it printed out our response. Now it's going to go get our contacts, and there's our contact one again. So you can see kind of, hopefully you're getting the idea of how simple it is to be able to utilize this framework and be able to connect to a CRM using the the server-to-server authentication. So it provides a flexibility for you to be able to really create applications, again, that are, the whole idea is that you want to create applications that are being used in a non-interactive manner. If you're creating an application and they're going to log in with their CRM credentials to that application, server-to-server authentication is not from you. But if you're creating an application that's going to run on a server, run every 10 minutes or something like that, there's not going to be anybody there to log in or anything like that, then server-to-server authentication is something you really want to strongly consider, because again, you're not using that named user for anything. So let's just jump back to our slides now. I was just looking any questions. Oops, we're already presenting the desktop. All right, we'll get the right button here. So now we should be back to our slides. So again, we looked at a demo, and just for the brief of time here so that I can kind of get through some of the other information I want to share with you. All of the samples that I'm going through here, that console application, as well as an ASP.NET MVC site and Web API, are hosted on our GitHub. Actually, let me just switch back to the desktop and we can just take a look at the samples here for a sec, just so you get an idea of what we're providing. GitHub and go to Adoxio. So on GitHub we have the Adoxio Connect library, and in here we have the samples. So we have one for that console application. It's basically what we just built. It also has the implementation of using the app config, so the app settings, instead of having them punched in manually within the actual program itself. And we also have a sample or two samples for both building a web app, so a normal ASP.NET, I should say a standard or a legacy ASP.NET web app. And we also just recently added a sample for doing an ASP.NET Core web app. So if you're interested in doing web development, I would strongly recommend that you do look at ASP.NET Core. It does have a ton of benefit, and I have written a blog post about doing an implementation of the Adoxio Connect using the ASP.NET Core. So if you're interested in that, then I would definitely tell you to have a look at this. And it basically will configure all of your CRM context as an OWIN context, which makes, with ASP.NET Core, makes it really to use through the dependency injection that they have native in the application as well. So if you're interested in doing that, then this is a really good sample for you to kind of start with. And it even has a sample controller that you can kind of go look at of how that dependency injection works. So it makes it really, really simple for you to bring in that context in any part of the application and then use it quite easily. So I'd invite you to go look at that blog post and then review it for your own needs. Is impersonation possible in this throughout? It is. You do need the permission in your security role to do that, and you can do your normal impersonation that you would do using just a standard user as well. So if you had a named user and you wanted to impersonate another user, you could definitely do that, provided the permissions are all available to you in the security role that you've assigned your application user. So, how does Adoxio use this? So we actually built a product kind of on top of this framework. We took our open source framework and basically took it and said, this is the foundation for the Adoxio Connect 365 product that we've been making. And the Adoxio Connect 365 product is basically just a way to extend the Dynamics portal with additional functionality. So if you wanted to add SharePoint or you wanted to add Esri maps or any sort of thing that required you to have C# programming, which is now restricted in the Dynamics 365 portal, the Adoxio Connect product does allow you to do that and basically is provided as the same software as a service as the portal for all of that. So we have pre-built modules for SharePoint, and it uses this underlying authentication mechanism as part of that. So the Microsoft portal, the Dynamics 365 portal, does use that authentication, that server-to-server authentication. So we want to follow the same pattern as them. So that Connect 365 uses that same authentication mechanism. And it is an ASP.NET Core app. Just like the sample, we started off with that sample and basically built around it. We built additional functionality using our knowledge of both the CRM SDK as well as the .NET framework and any other libraries that we want. So it kind of gives you back that ability to be able to kind of have that custom coding capability as well. So I do have some slides if people are interested in staying to the end, or Julie is going to let me go over if they're more interested in that whole companion app pattern as well. So another way in which we use it is with automated processes. We're very heavily pushing online with a lot of our clients, so we don't use the first one a ton, but there are a couple of clients where we do have them having either their own on-premise VM or some sort of Azure VM that is connecting to a Dynamics 365 instance. And on there, we'll throw a console application or some sort of Windows service that does that automated process or that non-interactive type of thing. We really, really do use a lot of Azure Functions. So we use Azure Functions with the queues, the triggers, and integrating them all into Logic Apps. So that is the primary use case that we use for automated processes is that Azure Functions. This is just how we use it. So you can use it in any fashion that you see fit as well. It really doesn't matter what you're going to be doing. Again, you just want to follow that whole, we're going to be using this in a non-interactive sense. So how you can get the framework, as we kind of looked at, it is available on NuGet. And again, I just showed you the samples. So you can go download the actual code that runs all of this CRM context and that framework itself. So you can go look at it, inspect it, kind of do whatever you want to access or modify it, and then include it in your own projects. And we have the samples there to help you kind of get started on building those. So that's the way that you can get started. And I will post this slide deck so you guys can have these links, and I will throw them potentially in the chat just once we get to the end here as well. So this is where we get to was there extra time? Because I wasn't sure how long all this was going to take. It does look like we got to our hour. So I'm willing to continue if people are interested in continuing, because I'm happy to talk about the Dynamics 365 portal companion app pattern. You might have heard Shan talking about this at some of his executive briefings or portal advisors calls. So if those of you wanted to stick around and Julie is okay with me continuing for a little bit, then I'm happy to talk about a pattern that we use to basically build our Connect 365 product and give you a little insight to how we're doing that in terms of building our products.
Colin, I'll make you a deal.
All right.
You continue as long as you have attendees, but I've got to drop off so you get to manage the recording.
All right. Oh.
So
is it going to keep recording if you leave?
It should, because you have the same rights that I have.
All right.
If it warns me, I won't leave, and then we'll renegotiate. How's that?
I can always start a part 2 of the recording as well.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
So stick around. Keep an eye on the Q&A for me.
Yep, definitely. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so let's see if Julie, when bows out here, it's going to lose our recording.